recording. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. Hope you had a great weekend. As you'll see from the screen, today the main focus of our call is the DNS access denied error page draft. Not the snappiest title in the world, but IETF presentation. IETF drafts rarely suffer from snappy presentations. So I'm delighted to say that Dan Wing, one of the co-authors, has joined us to sort of lead on the presentation with one of his fellow co-authors, Neil Cook, also on the call as well. So we should have a very thorough sort of run through of the draft, followed by an opportunity to ask questions. If you've got any questions that crop up, if you could use the Zoom facility, if you're able to raise your virtual hand. And if you're not in a location where it would be practical to talk, then feel free to post a question in chat, and when we get to the chat questions, the questions, I'll read out any questions from the chat as well. So without further ado, let me hand over to Dan and Neil to take us through the proposal. So gentlemen, over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. So we're going to start off with a problem statement that will be very familiar to everyone here, and then the approach that we're proposing in our draft for a solution, and security considerations, and a suggestion for what the error page should look like. So the problem statement, of course, is DNS filtering is used today to filter out websites for all sorts of reasons, legal reasons, policy of parental controls or enterprises, or by ISPs. And today that's handled by sending back a no such domain error, or by sending back a faked IP address. And that spoofed IP address, kind of an RPZ-like mechanism, typically points to a server, which might give some better answers for why an error comes back. We also had some other interesting things, such as that third point is MUD, which is a technique that we're trying to get enforced in a bunch of devices, mostly for IoT, so that the device indicates what its normal behavior is supposed to be, which can be verified with the manufacturer of the device. So for example, a thermostat is an easy example, which servers it's supposed to be talking to, so that when malware gets loaded on that device and it starts talking to other wild and crazy servers, that can be noticed right away. And DNS is used as part of the solution for MUD. The problem with sending back that forged IP address, that forged answer, is with HTTPS. That forged answer, whoever owns that server, like the ISP or OpenDNS, or whoever owns that server that they're sending back that fake answer for, they don't, of course, have a valid certificate for the real domain, whatever that is, piratebay.org, let's say. So that causes the subscriber or the end user or the kid at home to see this really scary looking invalid certificate error. And they will click through it, as people are trained to do, unfortunately. And this encourages more of that bad training, that bad behavior of clicking through these sorts of errors in order to get where you want to go. So it causes a bad problem because of HTTPS and the desire to tell the user what's going on. And that's the whole reason to send the user to this fake IP address, the spoofed IP address, is to show them an explanation about why they are being blocked. So what we're trying to do in this draft is solve really this problem. The DNS operator is trying to help the user understand why access is blocked, and we're trying to make that work better with HTTPS.
I should maybe just point out, Dan, that another common scenario is that people don't even try to put up a kind of invalid certificate, and they'll just destroy the TLS connection. So then you just get an even more strange page, which is TLS failed or something like that.
Yeah, because the philosophy is this behavior on the screen is so ugly and so bad, for training users to do the wrong thing, that it's best to just make the user's connection fail silently, which makes the ISP or the enterprise network feel flaky and feel, like it's there sometimes and it's gone some other times. So it's bad. Excuse me. So there currently are some extended error codes in DNSOP, which we looked at using, but one of the difficulties is every vendor has its own idea of what a gambling site is. And when a site does both gambling and malware delivery, or gambling and hacking, there's different priorities about which ones of those would be marked. And how to present that to the user. And that got just super complicated. So while those can be used, our consideration is they're not rich and they're not robust enough to send back to the user, and we needed something more robust to really help the user. And part of it is, why is the domain blocked? Something more than just censored or blocked is useful. So that the user can figure out how to get around it, or what network to get on, or who to complain to, or how to resolve the problem, how to quit looking at these sites, whatever the issue is. And then of course the forged answer, as I discussed, doesn't work for HTTPS. And we also considered the extra text field to be sent back in the DNS response. The weaknesses with that, a big one, was we can't authenticate that. So it ends up getting cached by the resolver, and we can't tell where it came from. Also, it's in whatever language was handy, maybe English, maybe French, and then it doesn't get translated for what the user needs. So we didn't like that. There was no nice way of having that be in the request and then get cached properly by the resolver for different languages that are all being cached by the resolver. You'd have to split how that's all being stored in its database, all pretty unpleasant. And forwarding that around, we lose who generated that message. Also, when the message is, when extra text is long enough to be useful, so if we encoded this in a bunch of text, it would end up being too long for DNS. So it's possible to encode this and indicate the languages and provide all of these other features, but then the response is so long it turns into an avenue of problems and attacks. So we moved it out of just being in DNS. So starting off with how we're solving this, we send back a new resource record option that has the error page URI. So the idea here is the client gets back the DNS answer saying that it's blocked, you can't get to this site, and it also has this URI that they can optionally go visit to go get details about why that domain was being blocked, why they couldn't get there. So this is what we send back is a template, which is then filled in by the client. This helps reduce some issues that we were bumping into. Neil, did you have some other color on this? Because I actually forgot all the details on why we were sending back a template instead of the full answer.
Well, a template just means that you can plug in the actual domain which you're doing the query against. So it's just much more flexible, and it's in line with the way that DO works as well. So otherwise, we'd have to have some fixed way of substituting the domain into a URI, which wouldn't work very well.
And we provide some suggestions for what should be in that error page that the user sees. An example below is what OpenDNS displays. A bunch of vendors do something similar, something slightly a little different, but explaining to the user why in the language that they asked for, which is the nice part about HTTPS, is the request can indicate their preferred language and which order. And also a place to click on, I think this is wrong, please fix this, this is miscategorized, so that they can fix this, and information on how to call the correct network operations center for wherever this filtering was being done, the enterprise, the ISP, or whatever.
I think actually just there was a point came up on the call that Roy from AT&T asked about, is this browser specific? I mean, it doesn't have to be browser specific, right? I mean, you, for example, if the user agent, this is nothing to do with the draft, by the way, right? The error page can do what it likes, but the error page could, for example, say, if you say I want application JSON, it could return JSON to you, right? It doesn't have to be a graphical web page based on what the client is.
And we are recommending some restrictions on how the browser looks at that page, which I'll talk about, I think, in 2 slides or so, that further help a browser, a simple browser like Lynx even, or curl, be able to process the data that comes back. But if it's a normal HTTP request, yes, it's expected to be a normal response in the sense that it's parsed by a person, not by a computer. We don't specify what the JSON would look like. For example, we don't have rules for where where everything should be and what the field names are and that sort of thing. That could be some follow-up standard that gets created either by us or by someone else. There's a bunch of processing rules that we have. Part of this is to deal with caching that occurs in DNS where our eDNS0 option is returned erroneously. So, like, for example, from an authoritative server back to a caching server where it was never requested. This could be accidentally leaked. We have a bunch of processing rules to deal with that. Also, like the last bullet, to make sure that we're making a secure connection back to whoever was making this block to begin with. So whoever made that request has to match up to the response. One of the other protections is if we ask a DNS server and we're connected to it. I think this is on the. Hang on, this might be on our next slide. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. But these are protections to make sure we aren't doing mistakes with cached eDNS0 options. Part of the processing rules for eDNS0 is that the caches ignore them and forward them on and store them. But if they don't understand this option, which no one will, as this is a new internet draft, it's not a working group document even yet. We want to detect that caching occurred and ignore the fact that there was caching. We only want to honor and pay attention to this eDNS0 option if it came from the resolver that we are talking to. So these are some of the additional protections against those threats that we have. So encrypted DNS, DO or DOT or DNS over quick are required. And we have to use a strict privacy profile, not the opportunistic for DOT. And we only pay attention to the eDNS0 option if it came from the same, or if it points at, the same server that we talk to for DNS itself. So if we're talking to ns.example.com, the eDNS0 option pointing us at the error page, explaining why a site was blocked, has to also be ns.example.com.
We used to have, I should just point out, we used to have a whole signing thing around that for signing the URI that came back, the template that came back. And it was just terrifically complicated. And there was all kinds of issues with forwarding. So we just got rid of that and basically went with the same origin idea, which is a lot simpler. It does create other potential issues though, right? I mean, which I think we haven't really worked through. I was just chatting with Peter in RDNS earlier, and if you've got a CPE that's running a DOH forwarder, for example, then that would, how would that work? Because the thing that's giving you it is like cpe1.isp.com or whatever, and so your error page would have to have the same domain name. So like how that would work is quite interesting. Maybe the CPE would have to host it, but you get the idea.
Yeah, and there's a similar problem if enterprise outsources their DNS to, let's say, 9.9.9, and they send it there, and they decide to filter a malware domain. That error page, does it need to point to the enterprise, and so that you call IT to complain about the mischaracterization, or does it need to point to 9.9.9 so that you call them, you as an end user call them, but you don't have a relationship with them? There's a nearly identical problem there.
Right, and the way this works right now is there would be no way to make it point to the enterprise. It would have to go to whoever's providing the DNS server that you're talking to, and the domain name for that.
Yep. And these are the restrictions I talked about, which help simple browser-like links and help ensure that something like curl that wants to process these things, these error responses, can see the error response and display it to the user. So no cookies, basically you know, an incognito sort of connection, but also a constrained connection in the sense that it's very much like captive portal, where autofill is turned off, and everything else that can cause any issues are turned off on purpose, because we're just trying to display a single page. And that's what we have for the presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan and Neil. I think this is aiming to address a problem which needs a solution. We'll see from the questions whether there's a consensus that it's the right answer, but at least having an answer is a brilliant start, in my view. Now, there are a couple of comments in the chat, but I'll try and take these in roughly the order that they occurred. The things were raised. So you addressed the first question in the chat, which was from Roy, with regards as being browser specific. I think after that, I think Glenn raised his hand next. Actually, no. Zoom is telling Gianpaolo.
So should I go, Andrew?
Go for it.
Go then. You go then Gianpaolo, and we'll take it from there.
Okay. So hey, interesting drafts. So a couple of questions, and they're sort of different topics. The first one would be, how do you envision treating things that are blocked, but you cannot disclose that they're blocked? We get a lot of requests around the world for that feature, because the courts say block it, but you can't tell anybody it's blocked or why. And then I'll throw out the second question here. You know, one of the things I really see as an issue potentially is both in enterprises and home networks and even ISP provided connections. We don't want a situation where the end user is getting a screen that's directing them to a third party that they, as you said, they have no relationship with, but also can't fix the problem. So like the examples are, an enterprise actually has chosen to block these things. They're using a third-party service to do the blocking for them, but they want these things blocked, and it's expected they're blocked. Likewise, in the home, if the parent decides to block, we don't want the kid sending an error report into you know, Quad 9 saying, please unblock me because I want to get to Discord, when the parent has in fact blocked them and they want them blocked. You know, Discord or the Cloud 9 guy, or sorry, not Cloud 9, the Quad 9 guys probably don't want to deal with that bunch of issues with those reports coming in. So if there's some way to direct them or push them to an edge answer, it might be preferable. And also in an ISP situation, I don't want them calling my help desk when in fact it's a third-party service potentially that their parents have turned on for their environment. So I don't want them calling my company help desk. I want them calling their parent or the people who actually did the blocking. Those are my two questions. I'll take the answer offline.
So your first one, how do we implement your draft telling the user why we blocked if we can't tell them why we blocked? The answer is don't implement this document.
Yeah, that's
and just block.
So
That's
what would you imagine would be the response? So if I'm a DNS operator and I'm not allowed to disclose that I've blocked it, what would I do? Just nothing?
You could return NX domain. You could, yeah, but I mean, this kind of sound of outside the scope of this draft. This draft is about providing more information, not less, I think. So.
I understand. We run into this quandary, this conflict. I'm figuring out how we resolve it without confusing the end user beyond belief.
Oh, the end user be confused. I think that's the intent of the government requirement. Is frustrate the end user and make them not understand where they should go. Because clearly, if you tell them your friendly DNS operator blocked it, the first thing the user is going to do is go find a DNS operator that doesn't give them that error for that domain. Thing is, that's like 3 more minutes of time versus, because it's trivial to go find another DNS operator. Used to be harder, but nowadays it's trivial to go find another one. So it's kind of silly. Governments are behind.
So what about the second question? How to push an error message that's more relevant to the edge versus the core? I guess is the ultimate question. So
the DNS resolver that the end system is configured for is what generates the error page for the user. So it has the best chance of knowing that it's the kid versus the parent. So if it's the kid that is being parental controlled, then that kid could be given a different error message or a different error text than the parent, and it could say, go contact your dad or your mom or whatever. Whereas the parent systems could be given an error message that says, oh, go contact 9.9, for example.
And how do you see the system differentiating the user at that level?
I think there's a probably more straightforward way to address this, right? That this we have to have the same origin. So if you're outsourcing, Andrew, can you mute some people?
I think I've got the right mute now.
Yeah. So you've got the same origin, right? So if you're outsourcing, what you can do, this does work with forwarders, because we're not doing the whole signing thing anymore. So if the outsource thing is returning a URI template, the forwarder, the thing that you're actually talking to, which could be your local CPE, it could be your enterprise, if your enterprise is outsourcing it, as long as you're doing forwarding and hosting the thing that you're talking to first, the DOH, and it has to be a DOH or DOT forwarder, obviously, then it could replace it with a correct error page URL or URI, which is local to that service, right? So you're not getting, that's basically a local page, which that would then have to match the domain name of the local DOH forwarder, for example. So you could absolutely do that, even though you're using a third party. I think the issue there is you then have to know like why it was blocked, right? So you'd have to have some kind of back channel. We don't get into that, but if you wanted to do that, that's how you do it. But specifically, this draft does not allow you to point you at somewhere else, right? So if it's Quad 9 doing the resolution, and Quad 9 is the thing that's the domain name that you're talking to, it has to be a error page redirect to a URI, which is the Quad 9 domain. And that probably just also comes into John Todd's question on the chat. It's about IP addresses and not domain names. Obviously, if it's an IP address, it's not authenticated, and we don't really address that scenario right now.
Well, it can be. You can have a certificate that has an IP address in it. In fact,
yeah,
we do.
Sure.
It's
we
just
don't address it in the draft.
It's not very clean.
No, it's not.
Especially for
there's not a lot of. I would say there's not a lot of support in any of the working groups right now for these kind of scenarios. It's just IP addresses and certificates.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Glenn, for the questions. Next, I think with his virtual hand raised was Jan Paolo.
I think that from the end user perspective, this draft address a problem that any parental control producer has. So to show the customer a human readable error page. But I think what is missing is a sort of a trust mechanism with the browser or the client. That is the reason why they are not showing pages with the wrong certificates. So I think it has to be extended with some sort of trust to be able to have a reliable blocking page. Otherwise, man in the middle attacks could be possible if somebody interact with those errors.
I think that is the point of the draft. So the draft's going to return a URI which must match the domain name of the DNS server, and also, of course, that it must be an HTTPS URI, which means that the browser must also then be able to validate the name of the certificate for that error page URI. So the issue of trust, I think, is dealt with within the draft in that respect. There will be no issues with certificates, or you won't be getting invalid certificates for these domains, but you shouldn't do.
Yes, but you have to trust the DNS resolver at a higher level, respect just resolving, because in case somebody is able to inject in your client a different DNS resolver, then he will be also able to show you pages. Even
Sure,
if
but that's a different thing, though, because you must have authenticated the DNS resolver, which is why we don't support things like opportunistic privacy profile, right? So you must be talking to an authentic DNS resolver over an encrypted connection, which has been authenticated. So I think that's the sort of axiom that we're basing this on.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gianpaolo. Right, we'll take the next three raised hand questions and have a look in the chat before taking any further sort of hand raises. So in the order that they're raised, I think Brett is next. If you want to, well, you are unmuted, so jump on, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. First of all, I have to confess to having not read the draft before, so this is my first viewing of it. But I think it looks really, really interesting. One of my colleagues at Nominate who couldn't attend has asked me to, who has read it in a bit more depth, asked me to ask a question, and that is basically, it looks like from what he reads and what I understand, that when you return this URI, that means that the browser has then got to go to that URI. So have you had any conversations with browser vendors, any buy-in from browser vendors to get this to get them on board to make this work?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, we're still socializing this. It's still an individual draft, and it really comes down to, do we want, or do browsers want to threaten the user with this bad certificate that they show them now, or do we want to have an opportunity to show something better? As DNS rolls into operating systems, there needs to be a way to get this information back out of the operating system DNS. If DNS stays as DOT, DOH in the browser, they can add support for this, but there's certainly an additional complication in getting this detail out, because it doesn't come back in old school DNS APIs. Yeah. So yeah, there's complications here in doing that. We're trying to improve the situation, and yeah, we are trying to socialize this with browser vendors.
There was an action at the last working group, DNSOP working group meeting, that the chairs would socialize this into other working groups, which were more frequented by browser vendors, etc. Because this is quite a cross-functional thing, as you say. It's about DNS vendors, it's about browser vendors, people that make DNS equipment, etc. So it's not doesn't naturally fit into one area. So it definitely will need that cross-socialization. We're not there yet.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Brett. I guess there's some people on the call that could maybe help with that socialization. Right, next with his hand raised was John, and then Peter, and then I'll go to the chat. So John next.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll agree that this looks like an interesting proposal and something that we've been hoping to see for quite some time. I would suggest, though, that there's seems to be a high focus on browser vendors, and I understand that that's the natural place to go. But to an earlier comment, it seems like the actual end goal here would actually not be the browser vendors. They would be consumers of something downstream, meaning coming from the operating system, or at least that's our hope. So that would imply that really the next step, which you also kind of glossed over and mentioned, but that this could be returned as a structured result of some sort. That almost seems like it needs to be immediately and in parallel offered as another draft as far as what does a structure look like for a response that is parsable by something that isn't a browser, so that it can then be carried up from the operating system to the browser, or remember, the internet is not necessarily all browsers, but to other applications which might want to do something with this, so that something like, as an example, Microsoft Windows could present an error page that is a modality from the operating system instead of from the browser when the operating system encounters this DNS error. But that implies really an almost immediate, like, what is the structured text? What are all the fields in there that are at least minimally viable to present something meaningful, so that this can happen from the bottom up instead of from the top down, which is kind of how it sounds right now. And it's really, we've gotten into the behavior of like, oh, the browser vendors do everything. Yes, they do. But I really would like to see this be able to be parsed from the bottom up as well. And, coming up with that structured text or the EDE extended message seems like a great thing to do at the same time. This was actually mentioned in the EDE mailing list about like, well, what is that extended text? What is in there? And the answer was, well, let's wait on next draft for that. So I'm pleased to see this is happening, but I also think that this is a great opportunity to make it be done the right way instead of purely a browser-centric model. So that's more of a comment than a question or anything, but I'm pleased to see that this is happening in some way that's moving forward.
I worry that we wouldn't be successful in defining that because it's been too hard so far. I would point out if we had this in Windows, for example, it could see the error coming back and it could send off its own edge. Even if you're running Chrome, for example, it could send off and generate its own Edge browser to display the modal from the operating system in much the same way it is using its own Edge browser to display HTML inside of its email client. And much the same way it's using its own browser to do the captive portal display in order to punch you through the captive portal and typing in your room number or your flight number or whatever. So it's possible without having to define, some structured data for that to come back. And maybe we can talk about that or socialize in that direction. But like I say, I'm super worried about the structured data, partially because we keep bumping into how do we get all the vendors to talk about all their different categories. I got 20 categories and this other vendor has 80 categories, and they overlap. And do I mark the most important one for this subscriber, the most important one for me, the most important one for my government, or my marketing this week? Or do I mark them all? And those philosophies are different between vendors. And maybe I don't know. We can.
Those become questions of policy. I agree, but the structure of a failed event and some way for both an automated system or a human to go and find more information about it, I think is vital, so that in the systems where we don't have humans involved, where there isn't a person that's creating the event, that there can be some reasonable way of managing those errors and either surfacing them, logging them, or redirecting them, I think is vital.
I think that is possible with the draft as it is today. That the error page URI, you can retrieve that without human or browser intervention. And there could be another draft indeed if you wanted to add some structured JSON or whatever it is that said, you say, I want the JSON version of this, and you get that, and then there could be a whole separate language or whatever for doing that. I do share Dan's concerns. I think that it's going to be very difficult to satisfy that in a way that makes everyone happy, and you've also still got the language issues as well. And the nice thing about HTTP is you can potentially handle all of those things when you've got it in HTTP, because you've got all the headers and things which you don't get in DNS. So I think actually that is a better channel for handling that, rather than to do it inbound in DNS, which doesn't seem like the right way to do it.
No, I would never agree that it should be inbound in DNS. It's just the pointer needs to go to somewhere that's structured.
Yeah, and nothing we're doing stops you from doing that. So there could be a whole nother draft on top of this, as you say, a side draft, which just uses that channel, but makes it all.
I think we can explore doing that, Neil, or maybe as an appendix or something as a start, and then peel it off and into its own draft. But just like the phone number to call and the link, the actual link to complain about this is miscategorized, and something like that could get us started on this without taking on. I think if we somehow avoid the categorization thing, which has been our problem to date, which category did, why did we block it? And that just needs to stay free form text, because that's chaos. There's a bunch of other stuff that is more easily structured and computer parsable.
And that actually goes directly to what Glenn was asking about. How do we, and I think it was Glenn that was asking about, how do you translate this going through an enterprise forwarder? So if there's an automated way of saying, all right, this was the responsible party, well, okay, then maybe the enterprise forwarder can swap that while retaining some of the other data and passing it through to the end user. So it allows you to change responsibility as well.
Okay. Point taken. I'm talking myself into it. Thanks.
Yeah, although of course, again, because of the restrictions that with the origin, that the enterprise forwarder would have to be the thing that actually hosted even if it was just forwarding it back on internally, you still have to host it initially.
For sure.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. A thought-provoking question. Right, we'll just take one more sort of a question, which we'll take from Peter. Then I'm going to go to the chat and then to Glenn. So Peter first, then chat, then Glenn.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, this is really interesting. And like a lot of other people said, it's really good to see some kind of discussion in the draft. I haven't read it thoroughly yet, but one thing that, I'm sorry, I'm Peter Lowe from DNS Filter, by the way. One thing a lot of our customers customize their block pages with their own URLs. So I think one barrier for us to adopt something like this would be that if the domain of the block page needs to match that of the DNS server, then it's going to be a problem, because a large part of our customers have their own domains and their own customized logos and everything. What John was saying about transferring the kind of the responsible party sounds interesting. So I don't know if that's been considered or not.
So Peter, your first thing on the customization, let's talk offline how you're doing that, because I remember talking with you guys 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
Okay.
And I think what we have in the document right now can handle the way that you identify the subscribers in a way that's super similar to what you do now, and split them out and get different error pages to them. But let's talk through that, and we can work on those details. And as for the rewriting that, I think that's something we got out of this meeting. Right now, the draft doesn't work well for that. I think it's the safest thing to say.
Okay.
It doesn't explain how to do that.
Cool. Well, I'm going to try and get involved with the discussions that you're having. So perhaps I could talk about the other aspects later.
Okay.
Thanks.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Right, just to look at the chat. I think the first question, there's some pieces in there to do with it, whether it works with non-browsers, which you've covered. So I think the first question, other than the fun observation from Mark about kids today, which you can apply to more or less any situation. The first substantive question, I think, is from Jim, which is, are users generally clueless enough to choose another DNS provider if they don't get an answer they like? And where does this draft fit in that concept? I think they're related.
He's referring to a different draft, the extended error code. So we very much build on the extended error code draft. So in fact, we say you shouldn't have returned this option unless one of specific EDE codes is returned, like blocked, filtered, or censored, whatever. So this very much fits in. It's designed to be sort of building on that and just adding extra functionality in terms of extra information.
To make a quick interrupt there, if that's the case, should there be something in this draft to say, the ITF draft that says, go to this web page to get this additional information?
Sorry,
so the extended error codes are giving us information to say this is a filtered reply, or we're not giving you some kind of response for policy reasons. Should there be an additional option in that extended reply packet which has a flag to say this is where you can find or even include the URL for the web page that gives more information about why the query has been declined?
Well, ED is already there, so this is just an optional extra on top of that. So I'm not sure. Are you saying that we should try to extend EDE with this information? Or?
Well, I'm not sure I wondered if you were, or you were thinking about that.
I don't think so. I think it's just building on it and having an additional
Okay, thanks,
option.
Okay.
Yeah, I think from what you're saying, this is intended to be complementary as an optional extra on top of EDE. Is that roughly right, Dan and Neil?
Yeah.
Okay, just scrolling down the chat. John rightly observes that if someone can take over your DNS server, worrying about error pages is probably the last of your problems. He says it's slightly different words to that, but I think that's the gist of it, which I think is a reasonable comment. Yeah, Jim Paolo raised this question verbally, so we can jump over that. Roy is commenting on the sort of structured format challenge, which I think you talked to as well, Dan. And surprisingly, I think that's, unless I've missed anything substantial, that's got to the bottom of the chat comments. So I don't think there are any further questions in there. If I missed something, then someone please pop it back in again or raise your virtual hand if you can. But in the meantime, Glenn, do you want to come off mute again?
Yeah, so I want to revisit, since Dan's warming up to the idea of these secondary messages pushed at the edge. You know, one way, when I see warning messages or informational messages like this is great for the user. But I also see it from the perspective of every time you put a message up, you're potentially generating a phone call or an email to somebody to help them fix the problem. And not all blocks are bad, by the way. I'll just throw that out there. So, you know, if you're warming up to that idea, I will really emphasize, think about how it will work in a CPE environment and how that, you know, real extreme edge of the network in the home, potentially managed by a parent or potentially managed by the ISP operator, could work with this in a very seamless fashion so that we can avoid calls, which makes everybody happier, but also makes the end user happier. So if you're warming to the idea, don't just do it for enterprises, do it for CPE environments as well.
I think, Glenn, you'll know that myself and Dan and Tiro are all authors of a draft which is dealing with CPEs for DOH discovery. So it's just top of our mind, I think.
And as you know, I'm a big supporter of your work. Love it and read it all the time before going to bed. It's awesome stuff.
Glad we help with your insomnia.
So, yeah.
I think it is.
Sure,
I think that's a
further
point
comments?
well made, and I think Dan and I are going to have some good things to talk to the other authors of this draft about.
Yeah. We admit it's not clean right now and needs to be improved. So thanks for the input. And I think we have ideas how to get it improved.
Fantastic. Right, any further questions from anyone? Just give you an opportunity if they've got anything you're mulling on, wanting to raise, give you a moment to do so. No, nothing is immediately jumping out. Well, I think it's fair to say, gents, that judging from the questions and conversation, there's definite interest in the draft. I'll confess I hadn't spotted it in amongst all the many other drafts, so I was really pleased when it came up in conversation the other day, because so if we can solve this particular problem, give meaningful sort of dialogue to users, that will be I think more useful than many internet drafts, in my humble opinion. So I think this is very much to be welcomed, and I hope that some of the people that ask questions will be in touch with you offline to provide further input and support as this document goes through its sort of later drafts. Any closing comments from either of you before we move on?
No, good. Thanks for the opportunity. This certainly helps improve our document.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you both. That's much appreciated. Right, so we're now in any other business in terms of the agenda. One thing which I wanted to just highlight quickly is in terms of upcoming events. I just wanted to flag that we got RIPE 82 coming up next week. And shortly afterwards, I think the following week, the Icann Dns Symposium. So we got sort of two events in quick succession over the next 2 weeks, which I think is certainly worthy of your attention to have a quick browse of the agendas in case your schedules can accommodate attending those. In terms of topics coming up on this call, also I just wanted to let you know that next week I've asked, and he's sort of agreed just before the start of this call, that Casey Adekio, I think, if I've not completely mispronounced his surname, will be able to join us to reprise a presentation he gave in the early hours, well, for those of us in Europe, of DNS OARC last Thursday, on a peek into the DNS cookie jar. And then the following week, we're going to be talking about Icann's kindness or KIN DNS initiative, which I mentioned a couple of weeks back in response to a suggestion from Ulrich. So we've got those over the next couple of weeks this month. So is anything pressing that anyone else would like to raise whilst we're talking today, as we've got a couple of minutes before we get to the end of the hour? So last chance we want to jump on if there's anything you want to bring up.
It's Casey DCO.
Casey DCO, thank you.
Yes.
Peter, that's helpful. I occurred to me as I was reading out his email that I don't think I've actually heard his surname pronounced by him or anybody else that knows him well. So that's
no. At OARC, he was also at OARC. The introduction was wrong as well.
Well, let's try not to make that twice in succession. Then that will be embarrassing, isn't it? Good to know that several of us were awake in the early hours. It was a very interesting session last week, by the way. So there's quite a few good slots on DNS OARC. So I think the recordings should be up in the next few days. So well worth a look if you weren't able to join the call, which I suspect many of you in Europe probably didn't. It was timed for Asia Pac attendees. So I think it was a good thing to be on if you were in Japan or Australia, not so much on this side of the world. Okay, any last thoughts from anyone? Last chance. I see no hands raised, in which case thanks all for your time. Thanks in particular to Dan and Neil for the presentation. I hope that will lead to some further inputs to your draft. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll speak again same time next week. So thanks all.